Have you ever walked into a room feeling completely fine, clear-headed, settled, maybe even quietly good, and then walked out 40 minutes later feeling like something essential had been taken from you? Not stolen exactly, more like slowly leaked. You drive home, and you're not sure why you're heavy. You replay the conversation. Nothing overtly bad was said. No one was cruel. And yet you feel like you just ran something much longer than you actually did. Or maybe it's a specific person. A colleague who sighs frequently and speaks in a register of low, chronic disappointment. A family member whose anxiety enters the room before they do. A friend who, despite your genuine love for them, leaves you flat every single time. And the worst part, the part that quietly eats at you, is that you've started to wonder if something is wrong with you, if you're too sensitive, too weak, too porous to function normally in a world full of ordinary human interaction. I want to stop you there. Because what you're experiencing is not a flaw, it is a feature. And understanding the difference is going to change how you see yourself. Here's the reframe that changes everything. The fact that you absorb the emotional states of others is not evidence of psychological fragility. It is evidence of a highly calibrated nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem isn't your sensitivity. The problem is that no one ever taught you what's actually happening inside your body when you're in those rooms. And without that understanding, you've been left to interpret exhaustion as weakness when it is actually information. So let's talk about what's actually going on. There's a concept in social neuroscience called emotional contagion, and despite its somewhat clinical name, it describes something profoundly human: the automatic, largely unconscious process by which we absorb and mirror the emotional states of people around us. This isn't metaphorical, it's biological. When you're in the presence of someone who is anxious, stressed, or emotionally dysregulated, your nervous system begins to pick up on a cascade of signals. The micro-tension in their facial muscles, the slight irregularity in their breathing, the particular flatness or edge in their vocal tone. These signals travel through your sensory system at a speed far below conscious awareness. Before your rational mind has formed a single opinion about the conversation, your body has already begun to respond. Part of this happens through a class of neurons called mirror neurons, cells in the brain that fire not only when you perform an action, but when you observe someone else performing it. They were discovered almost accidentally in the 1990s, when researchers noticed that monkeys' neurons fired identically whether the monkey reached for a peanut or simply watched a researcher do the same thing. The same principle applies to emotion. When someone near you contracts in fear or expands in joy, something in your nervous system rehearses that same contraction or expansion. You are, quite literally, simulating their inner state inside your own body. And then there's the stress axis, the HPA axis, which governs the release of cortisol, your primary stress hormone. When your nervous system detects a threat signal, even a social one, even a subtle one, this axis activates. Cortisol rises, your body begins preparing for effort. And if this activation happens repeatedly, if it's sustained over an hour-long lunch or a tense family dinner, you leave the encounter with an elevated cortisol baseline that can take hours to return to normal. That's not drama, that's biochemistry. Think of your nervous system like the engine of a car. It's designed to run warm. That's normal, that's functional. But certain driving conditions push the engine harder than others. City driving, stop and start, constant small adjustments. This taxes the engine more than a steady highway cruise, even if the distance traveled is the same. Being in the presence of a dysregulated person is city driving. You're constantly recalibrating. Small, rapid adjustments. The odometer barely moves, but the engine runs hot. And then you wonder why you're exhausted when you've technically done nothing. Here's another way to understand it. Your nervous system functions, in part, like a security guard at a busy entrance. One that was designed to assess every person who walks through the door. Most people get a brief scan and pass through. But someone radiating distress or unpredictability triggers a longer assessment. The guard stays on high alert. Shoulders don't drop. Eyes don't rest. and a security guard on a 12-hour high-alert shift is not in poor shape because they're weak. They're tired because the job demanded more. That's not a character flaw. That's a load-bearing reality. Why does this system exist at all? Because for most of human history, being attuned to the emotional states of those around you was survival critical. In small, interdependent groups, the ability to sense when someone nearby was frightened, before you consciously understood why, could be the difference between life and death. Emotional contagion wasn't a social nicety. It was an early warning system. If the person next to you tensed, you tensed. If the group grew uneasy, you grew uneasy. The individuals who were most finely tuned to these signals were the ones most likely to survive long enough to pass on their genes. The sensitivity you carry is an ancient inheritance. The difficulty is that the threat landscape has changed almost completely, while the nervous system has not. You no longer need to detect a predator through the posture of your tribe mate, but your system doesn't know that. It still treats the ambient anxiety of a difficult colleague as information worth tracking, worth responding to, worth burning energy on. You are a beautifully calibrated instrument, living in a world that never quite matches its original design. And there's a cognitive layer here too, what psychologists call emotional granularity, or the degree to which you can differentiate your emotional states with precision. Highly sensitive people often have richer, more differentiated emotional vocabularies, which means they perceive more gradations in both their own states and those of others. This perceptual richness is the very thing that makes you good at reading rooms, at understanding people without being told, at the quiet relational intelligence that others consistently rely on. It is also the thing that makes undifferentiated crowds and emotionally loud people genuinely harder to be near. The same instrument that plays more notes gets overwhelmed by more noise. So what do you do with all of this? I want to offer you a toolkit organized across 3 levels, not a list of tips, but a framework for operating more sustainably inside a life that includes other human beings. Level 1. Invisible tools. These are the practices that live below behavior. They shape your baseline before you ever walk into a difficult room. The most important is nervous system literacy, learning to identify your own physiological baseline so you can detect drift early. This means, concretely, checking in with your body the way you might check the weather before leaving the house. Before a draining interaction, notice your breath rate. Notice the tension in your jaw or shoulders. This isn't about controlling the interaction. It's about having a reference point, so you can tell the difference between your state and what you've absorbed. The second invisible tool is intentional solitude before, not after, high-cost interactions. Most people use alone time only as recovery, but buffering before a draining encounter is equally protective. Even 10 minutes of genuine quiet, not phone, not content, not distraction, gives your nervous system a baseline it can return to more easily afterward. Level 2. Tactical tools. These are the practices you use inside the interaction itself. The first is grounding your physiology in real time. This sounds abstract, but it's specific. Feel the weight of your feet on the floor. Feel the chair beneath you. This sensory grounding isn't a wellness cliché. It's a neurological interrupt. It redirects attention back to your own body and gives your nervous system something stable to orient around when the room's emotional temperature is rising. The second tactical tool is what I call creating intentional space inside the conversation. This means not mirroring in real time, pausing slightly longer before responding, speaking at your own pace rather than matching theirs, allowing brief silences without rushing to fill them. You don't need to match someone's emotional rhythm to be present with them. You can be fully there without being pulled entirely into their current. The third is strategic self-disclosure management. Highly absorptive people often also tend to give a great deal of attention, of insight, of emotional labor. In difficult interactions, practice keeping your own emotional contribution minimal and functional. You're not withholding, you're conserving. Level 3. Recovery tools. These are not luxuries. They are maintenance. After high-cost social experiences, your cortisol needs a pathway down. The most evidence-supported methods are physical movement. Even a 20-minute walk substantially accelerates cortisol clearance, and what researchers call restorative environments, nature, quiet spaces, or any context that asks nothing of your social brain. The key distinction is between distraction and restoration. Content consumption, scrolling, streaming, is not recovery. It delays it. True recovery is low demand, low stimulus, and ideally slightly boring. Your nervous system needs permission to land. Here's what I want to leave you with. The people who are most affected by the emotional states of others are rarely the weakest people in the room. They are frequently the most perceptive, the most relationally intelligent, the most attuned to what's actually happening beneath the surface of conversations that most people never think to examine. The same depth of processing that makes you absorptive is the depth that makes you trustworthy, insightful, and genuinely good with people, when you have the resources to show up that way. What you've been calling a vulnerability is, at its core, a form of precision. You are not a broken instrument, you are a sensitive one. And sensitive instruments require the right conditions to perform well. Care, calibration, the right handling. They are not inferior to blunter tools. They simply do something blunter tools cannot. You don't need to become less. You need to become better resourced. The exhaustion you've been carrying is not proof of inadequacy. It is the residue of a system that has been working very hard, without much understanding, without much support, and without anyone having told it that what it does is actually quite extraordinary. Now you know,